In this video, we're going to talk about Tiebout sorting. This is based on a paper called A Pure Theory of Local Expenditures from Charles Tiebout. So Tiebout follows the work of Musgrave and Samuelson in public finance theory. So Musgrave and Samuelson, they agree that there's one basic point under investigation, and that is whether or not there is a market type solution to determine the level of expenditure on public goods. So we've set up very well at this point in the class the problems with looking for the government to be able to do things that the market does. And these two agree that there's no such market type solution for the level of expenditure on public goods. The consequence of this is that a large proportion of national income ends up allocated in a way that is not optimal, is non-optimal when compared with the private sector. And Tiebout's first point is essentially this is true, but it's true for the federal government, for the national level of government. What Tiebout goes on to show and argue is that Musgrave and Samuelson, their argument ends up potentially not applying to local expenditures. We're differentiating between local and national. So the first thing we want to do is want to sort of talk about public goods. We've had an entire lecture about public goods in this class, but we're talking about something marginally different here, and this is collective consumption goods. So Musgrave and Samuelson define this as the consumption of a good does not reduce another individual's consumption. That should sound very familiar to you. We used a similar definition when we're talking about public goods themselves. However, Tiebout points out in this context of expenditure, this is actually a somewhat unique definition of consumption. So not public goods, but the consumption part in particular, because it has that classic component of, this is no diminished opportunities for consumption for other individuals. But it also means, in this case, this is what makes it unique, this second point here, is that consumption can actually be allowed to take other forms, right? So not only it implies that the act of consumption by one person doesn't diminish the opportunities for consumption by another, but also allows that consumption to come in another form, right? So this boils down to externalities and sort of that classic problem, which we'll circle back around to when the time comes. So Tiebout prefers this slightly different definition of public good. This also should sound familiar. This was also referenced in the lecture on public goods, but that a public good is a good that should be produced, but there's not a feasible method for charging consumers for producing it and consuming it. So not charging it for consuming it. I'm sorry. Not that we charge for the production of it, but for the consumer's consumption of it. And so we end up with not being able to make back our production costs in a way that a business would want to go about doing that. Notice that this is, there are lots of important caveats to this when we actually go and analyze public goods in wider settings, and we discuss that in great detail in the public goods lecture. Okay, so what's the core problem here? The core problem here is somewhat straightforward. It is, what is the mechanism by which voters register their preferences about public goods? Right, we just got through voting and Arrow, and we discussed all the manifold problems with this, right? But what Musgrave and Samuelson are looking at as the core problem is, can voters, and they call them consumer voters, I'm going to call them voters, but do you understand why they call them consumers? Because they're consuming public goods. How is it that their preferences for public goods end up being revealed? And then, of course, once those are revealed, how does the government tax accordingly in order to provide them? Right? So the government's job is basically, how do we figure out what the public wants, and how do we tax them for that? Right? And so the sort of common way that this will be thought about throughout this paper and the early literature in public finance, public choice, is the government's job is to pick a revenue expenditure pair or pattern for goods and services that adapts to the consumer's preferences, right? So the consumer has these preferences and they're fixed, and then the government tries to figure out how much to change their revenue taxation and their expenditure provision of public goods. Okay, so the really important work from Musgrave and Samuelson is that they've shown when we take our normal demand curves, you can only solve this conceptually. There's no real world solution to this. Now, if it could be the case that we could force consumer voters to show what their true preferences for public goods were, and then we could tax appropriately, then you could do that. But of course, there's no current way to go about doing that. And in fact, it is rational for a consumer to hide how much they have a preference for any given public good, which allows them to free ride. All of this should sound very familiar. It's basic public goods conversation that we had in that public good lecture. So the current method for doing this, of course, is a political mechanism, the political mechanism, and it says we want to figure out what the expenditure wants of the typical voter. You and I might even call that the median voter, or somehow we try to guess, estimate, picture what those are, and then we combine that with an ability to pay, all that vertical equity, horizontal discussion that we were talking about there. Boom, we get our current budget, and then we try to go through and figure this out. Now, in the sense that this is satisfactory at all, it is only so in theory, and that's because in order for us to do this, we'd have to have the following three things. One, we'd have to force the voter to reveal preference. This is impossible, obviously. Two, we would have to be able to satisfy them in the sense that a market would. So it's not good enough to just say, well, we know what they want, and then we produced it. But market also does that at minimum cost. So that's at least, because there's a million other problems with that. No innovation, no voluntary action, right? All these problems that we've discussed with government activity in the past. And then, of course, finally, you need to tax them accordingly, right? And the question is, can this be done at all? Can this even be approximated outside of a market? Which, of course, markets have trouble with public goods in some cases, as we've discussed before. Okay, so what Tiebout is doing that's so important is he observes Musgrave and Samuelson are talking about a centralized government, right? But many of these type of services that we potentially want from a government, notice that these aren't public goods in the sense that we think of them as public goods, but they're publicly provided. They are local expenditures. Police, fire, hospitals, education, court systems, the list could go on and on and on. They're actually provided locally. And so it's not really the case that we should be worried about providing them nationally or federally, right? So as we've already done in this class, but I'm going to repeat it because Tiebout makes a similar argument. And Tiebout basically says, look, historically local expenditures, state government, city governments, are bigger than national expenditures. And in recent years, they're sort of equal. Of course, in this class, we've shown that national spending has actually surpassed local spending. But his point still remains because local spending is still a very significant portion of public good provision, of it total expenditure. So it's not a trivial thing yet. This still really matters. And also notice that like the relative scale of this might not matter as much as the absolute scale of it. So that would be another way to think about it. Okay, so Coase says, well, let's just think about an example. Let's just take a case, right? You got a city resident, they want to move to the suburb. What's going to determine where they choose to live? He calls it municipality, right? We can think of that as a location. But a local government that's providing certain things, which of those factors will go into their decision making, right? If you got children, you're thinking about high-level expenditure, local expenditure on schools, right? You might prefer having a golf course. I know I would. I love having a municipal golf course here, and actually a high-caliber one. So if you're from Amarillo or you're visiting Amarillo, definitely go check that out. But we got other facilities and services, beaches, parks, policing, roads, parking. The list goes on and on and on. Some of those things are very valuable to some of us. You know, maybe you really like parks and your neighbor doesn't care that much about parks. You'll have different preferences over this when you go to move. Now, a lot of non-economic variables will also be considered, but of course that's not sort of relevant to this model. The big takeaway the big takeaway, sort of the underlying thing here, is that Tiebout says the consumer voter may be viewed as picking the community which best satisfies his preferences and his preference patterns for public goods. So the big difference between central and local provision of public goods is that at the centralized level, the preferences are as they are given, right? So at the central level, voter preferences are taken as given, and the government then picks revenues and expenditures to try to match. At the local level, it's actually reversed. Government revenue and expenditures are relatively set, and the voter chooses. Okay, this has several important implications. One is, as we have more communities and more variance between the communities, it gives more options, which allows which allows the consumer voter to pick a locale that is closer to his preferences. This is like going to the store and you have some combination of drinks and flavors and sizes, right? And if the cherry flavored drink only comes in large and the root beer flavored drink only comes in very small, then you might want a large drink, but you might want a large root beer drink. You're left choosing between sort of suboptimal choices. Which matters more, that you have a large drink or that you have the flavor that you want? The more options you have, the closer you're going to get to your preferences. Of course, the market is literally designed. It literally works in a way to discover what those combinations are and satisfy the most number of people possible given minimized cost. But in this government situation, we can imagine the more communities, the more variance, the better in terms of matching preferences. Okay, so let's take a look at Tiebout's model, and he says he calls this an extreme model. It's really not so bad as far as that goes, and then we'll talk in a minute about sort of relaxing some of these assumptions. So 7 assumptions. The first is that consumer voters are fully mobile, and so they will move to the community where their preference patterns are met. In my graduate class in macroeconomics, I often talk about labor mobility and how labor mobility has fallen. If that is true and real, then we would expect this assumption to not match reality especially well. Of course, I would argue there's some reverse causation there, where we actually have fewer and less varied communities now, so there's less reason to move. And I actually discussed that in my podcast, so you can find that. The labor mobility podcast discusses all of that. Second is that voters have full knowledge, so consumer voters know the differences between the revenue and expenditure patterns, and they react to those differences between the potential communities. Third, of course, that there are many communities which you can pick to live in. Fourth, that employment is not a factor, right? So we sort of have this idea that everybody can pick different places to live based on where they want to work. Fifth, there are no external costs or benefits. Sixth, that there is an optimal community size. And Tiebout belabors this quite a lot in his original paper. And I think it's fairly intuitive, but you can imagine, right, there are real resource constraints. And so some of the things we might offer, like a beach is the example that he uses, it has a limitation in how big it can possibly be. And so there's an optimal number of people that a community that has a beachfront would be able to satisfy. Okay, so long story short, right, it's important that we fix the community size. It's not always just bigger is better in terms of cities, which of course we know to be true. And then finally, given that there is an optimal community size, communities seek to optimize their size by attracting new residents at lower average cost. So people want to find preference matching cities, and cities want to attract the right number of residents. Okay, so that should be relatively straightforward, but what I want to do really briefly is just talk about this idea, right? It can sometimes, it's very easy to think of the case where a city is too small, it wants more people, it tries to attract more people by providing more amenities. In some cases, you've got a city that's just the right size, sort of it's at that optimal size. How do we maintain the optimal size? One obvious thing is like zoning laws, land use regulations, agreements between realtors, etc., that sort of keep your population stable. There's not much change, and any inflow is matched by any outflow. the hard case is really what happens if it's too large, right? So you got a case of a city that's too large and it tries to get rid of residents. It's sort of hard to imagine, right? So no government is going to say, oh, our city's too big, we should get rid of people, right? There's no people that are going to be running for re-election on that platform. And yet there are natural economic forces that are going to be at work here. Anytime you see people moving to suburbs, what are they doing? Find better schools, find more parks, better housing, so on and so forth. This is really a pattern of having better amenities because the city that you're moving from is potentially too large. Okay, now the real kicker here is the ability to move, right? So the act of moving or not moving is absolutely crucial to this model. So moving or failing to move is like that usual market test of willingness to buy a good or service, and it reveals that consumer voters' demand for the public good, right? So each location has a revenue and expenditure pattern that reflects the desires of its residents. This is sort of the key, the heart of it, right? And then the next step is, well, what happens with our allocation of public goods at each local level? Okay, so this is where we sort of have that flip that I was talking about earlier. At the central level, the preferences are fixed and the local governments adapt. At the local level, we try to attract citizens. You can actually think of the local government being adopted by, sort of reverse, adapting to, adopted by the economic system is what Tiebout called it, but we mean the residents moving there. Okay, so let's take a look at like a trivial example. Like what would happen if we just had infinite cities, right? What if we just had an infinite number of cities? Well, if there's no reason for there to be an optimal number or optimal size of cities, right, we actually would get the exact match between consumer and their preferences in a situation where there are an infinite number of cities, right? So the number of communities just infinite. They all pick a different pattern of expenditure on public goods, right? Any city among this infinite combination of expenditure on different types of public goods that doesn't attract anybody is just a city that is empty, right? And then now you have an infinite number of cities. You have all these consumers out there. They'll just pick a community that exactly satisfies their preferences, right? I mean, some cities might have one person in them. As long as we're allowing that in our model, no problem, right? And so we just have exactly the market model, right? Actually, that's a point we should add here, right? This is a market. This is a market outcome. Because we have a constraint here in governments that we don't have in the market situation. Okay. Of course, this is not very realistic because we have these other constraints that are going to come into play with how many and what type of cities can exist, right? Tiebout says this model is not even a first approximation of reality, right? And so the idea here is we need the assumptions of modeling local government expenditure to really give us a realistic model. So how do we do that? Well, we want to look into the allocative results, right? So take your model, those 7 points, right, sort of fall short of that optimal, and we can demonstrate why, right? So back to our city with the beach, right? Say it's got a 500-yard beach, and your optimal population is 13,000 given your preference patterns. And then some people, in additional to those optimal 13,000, choose that community if it's available, right? They can't move to the area. They have to accept the next best substitute because that city is not looking to attract more people. So if you got a perfect substitute, no problem, right? There's no issue. Those people just live in a different city that has the same amenities exactly in the pattern that they want them. But if they're not found, then this is a failure to reach the optimal preference matching of communities to individuals, and you end up with some of those people ending up in a worse off position because they can't get exactly where they want. Of course, this is a matter of degree. How close is their second best city to their first, right? How close is their second best city to their first, right? So the more communities there are with a variety of patterns, the closer that this solution that we're discussing will approximate our ideal market solution that we just discussed. Okay, so what are our 2 points related to allocated results, right? One is very straightforward. Changes in the cost of public services will cause changes in the quantity of public goods provided, right? This is straightforward supply and demand. And 2, the cost of moving from one community to another should factor in, right? And this is really important because, right, whenever I said, oh, full mobility, you thought that's probably not realistic. And the reason you thought of that is, of course, very naturally that you were thinking of this cost of moving idea. Let's take an example straight from Tiebout's paper. And Tiebout says, suppose you got lifeguards, they organize, and they raise their wages, right? So now the cost in producing of the public good of the swimming pools or beachside activity has gone up, right? So now total taxes in those communities with beaches have to rise. The ones that don't have beaches, they do not. Residents who are sort of indifferent to beaches have to make a decision. Is saving that tax worth the cost of moving, right? This is straightforward economics. That's cost-benefit analysis. It's supply and demand. It's the heart of the field, right? Is it worth me moving somewhere that doesn't have a beach to avoid the tax that's been raised in the city that did have a beach, right? This, of course, depends on many factors. The maybe principle of which is, are there and how close is any community that would be a good substitute, right? If the place that I want to move is far away, or if no such place really exists, then I won't move, right? Now, if enough people go on and leave the communities with beaches, move to communities without beaches, the total amount of lifeguard services will fall. Just like the private situation, the mobility as a cost registering demand, the higher the cost, the less optimal the allocation of resources. This is transaction costs, right? Which, of course, we've studied in detail in this class, transaction cost. Okay, so it's very important, actually, that we understand that this shouldn't be like blown out of proportion. This is exactly analogous to what happens in the market, right? You have to go to a grocery store in order to shop, right? You have to pay a cost to register your demand for private goods. In the same exact way, you potentially have to move in order to register your preferences for public goods. Those are the same thing. It's just the transaction cost of moving is probably higher. So it's the same idea. It might just be different in magnitude. Okay, so now let's take a look at externalities. Right, remember we had assumption 5, and it said, well, you actually do have external costs and external benefits between communities. And so, if my neighbor sprays for bugs, I benefit from that. If the city closest to my city does a poor job in policing and you end up with lots of crime, that will have consequences for me in the city that I live in. In those cases where you have external costs and benefits, and when those are sufficiently large, the outcome is that you might actually want integration between different levels of government or different geographies of government, right? So a good example of this is not all aspects of law enforcement are adequately handled at the local level, right? So you've got state police, FBI, they perform differently than local police. Most of the time, right, we want local police rather than national police, and we want them to know their people and be integrated into their communities. But it's very difficult to catch serial killers that way. It's very difficult to stop organized crime that way. And so we might have some external costs that can be solved by integration. Okay. The other thing we might want to think about is whether mobility and knowledge are good approximations of reality. Of course, we know we're not perfectly mobile and we are not perfectly knowledgeable, and yet we see good empirical evidence of most people have a good sense of these things and they are surprisingly mobile when it comes to making these decisions, right? At some point, a cost becomes too burdensome, and we weigh our different options, and we potentially move cities if we don't like the city that we're in. I think one of the reasons you might intuitively disagree with this a little bit is, again, because we don't see that as much, because cities, we actually don't have a wide variety in different policies. Cities are very, very similar, actually, these days in practice. Okay. So, what are the policy implications? Policy implications are threefold. The first, integration is only justified when more of a service is available at the same total cost without reducing other services. A general reduction in a cost that comes with a reduction in some of the other services cannot be justified on economic grounds unless you know the social welfare function, which, as Arrow showed, we cannot know. We do not know it. We cannot know it, right? So we should never see higher levels of government interfering with lower levels of government unless they can do it in a way that is a Pareto improvement. Okay. Our second idea here is policies that promote residential mobility and increase the knowledge of the voter will improve allocation of government expenditures in the same sense that mobility between jobs and knowledge relevant to the location of industry and labor improves the allocation of private resources. And then finally, there's a normative question here. To what extent local government should have a fixed revenue expenditure pattern? Should it be the case that local governments just fix their revenue expenditure and let people move in and out? Long story short, Tiebout basically says this fits much better when we avoid mega cities. Large metropolises should perhaps act more central, and non-major cities, New York, Los Angeles, should potentially act more like he's showing here in this model. Okay, conclusion. For some public goods, the problem of provision does have a conceptual solution. If your consumer voters are fully mobile, the appropriate local governments whose revenue expenditure patterns are set are then adopted by consumer voters. The solution is not perfect because you have institutional rigidities, right, which is a fancy way to say lacking mobility and knowledge, and you have external costs. But that, of course, doesn't invalidate the solution. It just gives realistic parameters and cost-benefit drawbacks to it. This solution, just like our solution in a private situation, is the best that can be obtained given the preferences and resources.